I thought I'd start with a little bit of software as a service in the news. Kind of a fun thing about teaching this material is that it's pretty current. And so interesting things happen that we can actually tie back to some of the stuff that we've been talking about in the class. And a few days ago, I read this article in Ars Technica, which is one of my favorite sort of geeky but not too geeky blogs. I don't know if people are familiar with the term denial of service attack. Denial of service attack is when you attack a service not because you want to get service, but because you want to give it so much work to do that nobody else can get anything done. And a DDoS is a distributed denial of service where you somehow recruit many, many different computers to sort of do this together. This is one of the main reasons that you should care about malware. Most of the time, people who are installing malware or trying to install it on your computer have very little interest in anything on your computer. They just want to use it as one more bot that can participate in some of these distributed attacks. So apparently, the biggest distributed denial of service attack of all time was being generated due to, depending on how you want to look at it, a feature or a flaw in the design of HTTP version 2. Now, when we introduced HTTP in this course, we introduced it as HTTP version 1 because it's fundamentally simpler. And from the point of view of what we're doing in this class, which is building the application, for the most part, the mechanics of HTTP are largely invisible to you. Like once in a while, you might have to deal with HTTP headers and things like that. But in general, in today's ecosystem, you are not the folks who are writing the HTTP server or managing it directly. You're probably delegating that to a platform like Heroku. So we didn't really talk too much about HTTP protocol version 2, which is starting to get into wider use. But one of the big differences from the protocol point of view, we didn't talk about TCP/IP a whole lot. We just sort of said it's this nice abstraction of a pipe. Things go in, things come out reliably at the other end. But in fact, if you look under the hood, the way TCP/IP works is when you establish a TCP connection to a remote host, there's what's called this three-way handshake where the client says, hey, and then the server says, hey, and then the client says, we both said hey. So that's called the SYN, the SYNAC, and the ACK. So there's a certain amount of overhead in sort of opening a connection in order to do HTTP. And once you're doing HTTP, you can do requests. And in HTTP 1, the model is that you send a request, you wait for a reply. You send a request, you wait for a reply. There were enhancements in HTTP after 1.0 that allowed you to reuse the same TCP connection for multiple HTTP requests. But in general, it was still the idea that once you sent a request, you would have to wait for a reply. And even if you tried to send multiple requests over the same TCP connection, there was a limit to how many requests you could have in flight at the same time. And the key thing to remember here is that when the server receives an HTTP request, resources are immediately consumed at the server, whether it's going to respond or not. So what changed in HTTP2 was basically there's a new protocol feature so that you've opened a TCP connection, but now within that HTTP session, you can actually send as many open-ended requests as you want because once you send a request, immediately afterward, you can send a cancellation for that request. And there's no agreement with the server about that. The client is allowed to sort of do that unilaterally. So you could say, get some URI, and then immediately afterward, you could say, oh, forget it, I don't care about that anymore. But in the time it took to do that, the server had to dedicate some resources to accepting the first request. And in HTTP2, because you can essentially cancel a request immediately after you issue it, there's no practical limit to how many requests you can have in flight, and therefore to how much work you can make the server do. So, very large sites like Google and very large cloud providers like Cloudflare have distributed edge networks that try to sort of spread out the pain of some of this stuff. And sort of a follow-up post from Google said, fortunately, because we have so much infrastructure that is designed to sort of detect and mitigate these attacks, that there wasn't much impact on Google services, but the attack was severe. And apparently, at the peak of the attack, they were getting 389 million requests per second, which is a lot. So it's kind of interesting, the lesson here is, why did HTTP2 include this design feature? They did it because if you properly use this feature, it's much more efficient for the client and the server to exchange information because once the overhead of opening that TCP connection and establishing an HTTP session has been paid, you can exchange as many requests as you want without repeating all that overhead. But unfortunately, it turns out that that exact same feature makes it more efficient for attackers to attack you. So there's a design lesson in there somewhere, right? Be careful when you're trying to make something easier to do or something that will make things more efficient. It's important to keep in mind what are the ways that that feature could be misused. And so I don't know what the sort of long-term I don't know that there's sort of a patch to HTTP2 that will fix this, but I'm going to sort of keep monitoring it because I'm interested in seeing what's going to happen. Because part of the push for HTTP2 is that because it's so much more efficient, sort of everything will go faster. And yeah, everything went faster, including distributed denial of service attacks. So that's today's little news item.
Yeah, I'll add two things. One is, unfortunately, it's not offered very often, but if you want to think about why things like reusing a single TCP connection make a huge difference, CS168 is a networking class. And the thing that I think will blow your mind is that even though we treat, and largely in this class, we're talking about a cloud that we don't have to think about and interact with. The internet, and indeed pretty much everything around us, comes down to physical infrastructure. And when you're dealing at bits moving at the speed of light, even transaction times and round trip times between your computer and server start to matter. And so I think it's just a fascinating thing to dive into the math of. The other thing that I'll note, perhaps relevant to this class, is that one of the reasons that this becomes important is that as our web apps have more bits of CSS and JavaScript, and as they make more AJAX requests or use more and more connections to a server, these optimizations become important because pretty much every site that you visit is downloading not just a single JavaScript file, but many JavaScript files. And so one that changes to HTTP2 makes it a lot easier to develop modern web applications. Of course, if that turns out that it's hard to exploit, we have other trade-offs to consider. But, these things happen, for good reason usually. And so I think it's sometimes gory details, but there usually are interesting insights and lessons in those gory details.
Yeah, these things do happen for a good reason. Although honestly, sometimes when I use the debugging console window in Chrome to see what's actually being loaded in the background, most of what the JavaScript is that seems to be being loaded is trackers and add things and stuff that I really don't want. So that's a good reason that I leave it to you to decide. Anyway, get off my lawn. Let's move on to today's content.